Welcome to the latest episode of MQ's Open Mind podcast. And today we're delighted. We have got Dr. Chloe Paidoussis Mitchell, who's a counselling psychologist. And we're really excited to hear some of your work that you've been doing, Chloe. But in particular, I know you've a book coming out, I think it's next month, The Lost Prescription, a practical roadmap to grief and recovery. And we'll hopefully talk about that. But more broadly, we're really interested to talk about grief more generally. So first of all, welcome and thanks for coming to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here.
Yeah, welcome in.
So, Chloe, we tend in the podcast, we just tend to have a sort of hopefully a meandering conversation.
Sounds good.
Let's begin though with telling us a bit about. So, you've been I knew you're a counselling psychologist for quite a while, number of years, shall we say? And
yeah.
But maybe before we get to the counselling psychology end of things, can you tell us a bit about your journey into mental health? How you get into mental health?
Yeah. My journey in mental health, I suppose, started really early on, where as a teenager, I lost my grandmother, who sort of represented a motherly figure for me alongside my lovely mum at 13. And that was a bit of a wake-up call because I didn't really know how to deal with it. I hadn't really ever navigated loss before. And quite soon after that, a couple of years later, a friend of mine suffered a traumatic event, losing a family member very suddenly and very violently. And I watched the impact that had not only on her, but on our community. And from then, that point on, I guess because I felt so helpless, because I felt so overwhelmed myself and afraid in many, many ways, I hadn't realized that terrible things can happen to really good people at that point. I was so young. I guess that sparked me off, I suppose let my curiosity, and I've wanted to give back. I've wanted to help. And that's kind of what I've done. So when I was born and bred in Athens. I grew up in Greece and came over to the UK, studied in Wales, and have always been in this world of psychology.
Hold on, so you moved to the UK as an adult?
Yeah, I came here when I was 19. Yeah.
Your accent, you wouldn't know that from your accent.
No, I know.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a cheat, isn't it? Because my mother's English, so we spoke English at home, so I sound pretty English. And also, 30 years later, I'm married to an English man. I have two teenage kids here, so English feels like a mother tongue to me too. But I suppose my soul, my spirit is very Greek. I'm very Mediterranean, and I sort of navigate the two. But interesting we're talking about that, because one of the things that I wasn't prepared for was the chronic loss of being a migrant, of living away from your own home, your own homeland. And that's a kind of perhaps not such an obvious loss to people, but something that I live with really quite intensely sometimes. But
that's interesting. Just thinking about the different experiences of loss, and I'm just thinking. Just you mentioned that as an Irish person living in the UK, it's not quite as far a distance, but there is something about, because I feel much more Irish living in Scotland than I certainly.
that's the Celtic.
Yeah, and when I lived in Ireland, but also complicated by the history of obviously conflict in Northern Ireland, what that represents as well. So there's lots of conflicting things going on. So yes, that's it. So in your experience, so that your Greek identity is obviously very strong, and is that sense of loss then? Do you still feel it even?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I do. In some ways, I do. I think I've got a bit of a particular. I wasn't expecting to talk about this, but I'm really happy to. In that I grew up as a sort of mixed culture kid in the 70s and the 80s. And at that time, Greece wasn't a particularly international place. So I was always a bit of a foreigner in my own land. So I always felt a bit of a kind of a little bit at a loss, a little bit dislocated. And then whilst I'm here, I sort of am not obviously foreign, but there are a lot of things that feel quite foreign to me even now, even 30 years later. So yeah, I think it's one of my little demons, I guess, that I have to deal with. Where do I belong, and what does that actually mean? But the work I do, once I did my psychology degree, I was really lucky and got a job in an organization I loved. It was BBC News, and worked with a lot of brilliant people, supporting them as a coach, learning and development coach, and was there at a time of kind of 9/11, when PTSD was starting to kind of be a bit of a wave. And that's what threw me into kind of real deep interest in trauma. What is it that dysregulates and disrupts people's capacity to function, to be themselves, even people that have been exposed to a lot of, hostile situations or tricky, high stress situations. So yeah, my journey with loss, trauma, and mental health has sort of, been quite meandering, as you say.
Yeah. And how did you end up then doing the counselling psychology?
Yeah, yeah.
You done the degree first, you spent some time working in the BBC, you said, and then
Yeah, so I did my psychology degree, loved that, but wasn't quite sure at that young age how to use it. So I went into the corporate world, but fancied doing something kind of quite different and in London. So I was fortunate to get a job for BBC News, was there for quite a number of years. And at the time, because really brilliant news crews and professionals were struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, the BBC didn't know what to do about it and started working with the Ministry of Defence out of duty of care. What do we do? And that was the beginning of debriefing of the TRIM trauma recovery. And I was fortunate to be trained by Professor Neil Grunberg, who is the authority on this. And as I did that in my mid-20s, I realized actually this is what I want to do. And I went off and I did my doctorate, and I trained in existential counselling psychology, which kind of married up a more reflective philosophical approach to what is it to find meaning and what is it to move through challenging situations, as well as clinical. So that's how I ended up getting into that world, really.
people then who don't know the distinction between a counselling psychologist and a clinical psychologist, both are protected titles from obviously the health HCPC, the Health and Care Professions Council. So, but they're different types of applied psychologists. Both see
They are.
individuals, but potential patients. But can you maybe tell us a bit, for the listeners, a bit about the distinction?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's going to be helpful to listeners that in the end, in a psychological services department, the kind of work that a clinical psychologist or a counselling psychologist would want to have the same end result, which is about embracing mental health, finding well-being. Now, the way in which they might go about it probably differs, in that a counselling psychologist often looks at the underlying causes, may look at a longer term therapy, may dig down into kind of the interpretative nature, the individual lived experience. So it's more focused on understanding the underlying drivers. Whereas I think clinical psychologists, and I have to be careful because I'm not a clinical psychologist, are often working in a model which is cognitive behavioral. They are quite clinical. They're quite kind of keen to medicalize anxiety, depression, and work along the medical model. Whereas I prefer not to do that. I don't dismiss it. It's just something that doesn't resonate with me, because my experience is that if we medicalize anxiety or depression or stress, we go into a space of fear. We go into a sense of it's something that's happening to me, and therefore I'm going to be stuck with it forever. And I don't like that. I think people can recover their mental health and can find a way to function and live really fulfilling lives whilst also coping with difficult symptoms. Does that answer the question? I think it does, yeah.
Yeah, it does. I think there's probably different interpretations of that distinction, as you say, because obviously there, as we'll, I agree, there's lots of clinical psychologists out there who don't espouse CBT approaches and psychodynamic approaches or mentalization type approaches. Yeah, but my sense certainly of my knowledge of this sort of the counselling psychologist, which you're of one in front of me, is exactly it's often a different theoretical perspective, or more maybe sometimes more Jungian approach. I can't even say Carl Jung there.
Sometimes I think it very much depends on the individual, but in the end, I don't think any of it matters that much, because what I think is critical in efficacy, let's say, of all therapy is two things. One, the therapeutic relationship, the alliance that you're able to create with whoever they are, whether they're a clinical or a counselling person, and how invested you are in your therapeutic project, how keen you are to actually find a way that sits well with you, that makes sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really helpful then. So moving on then, Chloe, then, so this is sort of mental health research podcast. We've covered the breadth of topics, and we'll come back to the sort of your book shortly and how that's come about and so on. But what would be helpful though is to think about, so if you had all the money in the world and somebody said to you, right, what's the key research question in the sort of broad grief field that we should be addressing? And maybe similar in terms of your, over the last number of years, are there key advances in sort of the world of grief in terms of this evidence base. And I suppose because as somebody who works in suicide prevention, so we come across this very complicated situation, people who are bereaved by suicide, and obviously there's different models or more tailored models I've certainly come across trying to understand grief in that context compared to other traumatic deaths or deaths more generally. So maybe, I know that was two or three things there, one question. First of all, what's you see is, if you had all the money in the world, what you would say is a priority research question?
I don't think we can actually do this, but the answer I want, sorry, I'm going about it a slightly different way, is what is actually the key factor which means some people become so clinically unwell as a result of trauma that all the good therapy in the world can feel inaccessible. Nobody really knows what causes it. There are different, as you know, various theories, and I think I'd like to know that. Is there something that we're missing? Because my approach is always holistic, and thinking about what you were saying earlier about advances, the neuroimaging studies, particularly the work that Mary-France O'Connor is doing in the US, is so brilliant, so interesting, and I do refer to it in my book, looking at the neuroscience of grief and how it does actually impact people on that sort of neurochemical level, and how we can support that as clinicians and psychologists and therapists.
Yeah.
That I'm really fascinated by.
But do we know anything? No, I think that's a great suggestion. But going back to your first point about who, like that fundamental question of, if we compare two people who go through the same traumatic experience, one becomes well and the other doesn't. But do we have any sense, like, of, so I'm imagining people with previous history of trauma are more vulnerable. Are there other markers?
Oh yeah, there are loads. It's a really good question, and one that I think about a lot. And actually, part of the work I do as a therapist, as a clinician, is sort of trying to understand the factors that shape a person's mental health experience, and all sorts of things. So historical things like childhood adversity, way in which loss or other traumas were modeled in childhood or in adolescence, cultural perspectives, what's normal in one culture may not be in another. You know, I think communal support, your personal story, how you frame your journey in life, what you tell yourself about yourself, I think plays a huge part, whether you are in a lack or a fear mentality or not. Obviously, your biochemistry plays a part. The kind of cumulative stress and trauma, I think, plays a huge part. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot at the moment, and research is showing that we're not actually seeing post-traumatic growth following the pandemic. We're seeing the opposite. We're seeing about nine out of 10 people getting quite close to burnout and severe stress. So something's happened in that we haven't done that thing where we might rise above a trauma and feel like we've got something meaningful out of it. Life's not yet back to normal, I don't think, for many families.
And have we any sense of why that is?
Yeah, I think because people, lots of things. I mean, these are my observations from my clinical work. What I read is people are operating in silos. I think there is a lot of excess illness and excess deaths, sadly. I think there are a lot of children with mental health problems. So today I was at a children's mental health event that was talking about there's a 53% increase in young people being referred to CAMHS, 47% increase in eating disorders, so that the young are having a hard time. The parents, the caregivers are on burnout. I think there's lots of things contributing. Pressures of working from home, lots of people are struggling still with that. Lots of breakdowns, lots of family breakups as a result of COVID. Lots of people are going through divorce, separation, and of course financial stress. I think that's the biggest predictor of deteriorating mental health, isn't it? I mean, I know I'm constantly worried about, you know, income and how will I stabilize life and how will my children be all right, and you know, all that.
Yeah, of course.
Lots of things. I don't know whether you see any of this in your work. I imagine you do.
Well, no, of course. I think all the things you've just cited there are risk factors for suicide, certainly, except the one difference was, I suppose, is that suicide rates didn't increase during the pandemic. However, but you mentioned young people there was evidence of increase in suicide attempts amongst young people. And I agree. Even before the pandemic, we've known that young people's mental health has deteriorated. And yeah, so I suppose with the pandemic, we're still trying to work it through and understand.
I think so.
The consequences, but it's that perfect storm of COVID pandemic and cost of living crisis and war in Ukraine,
Yeah,
and now
exactly.
on the Middle East and the climate crisis. These things are all weigh heavily on our young people. So
Yeah,
huge impact.
I
So
agree.
now really interesting. So bringing it back though, just to, one thing that struck me was when I was thinking about this podcast today is I remember in my psychology undergraduate degree, was it Kubler-Ross, the
Oh
Kubler-Ross
yeah,
theory?
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Yeah,
Yeah, that theory. Shouldn't she have a
five
theory?
stages.
She's a theory of grief, hasn't she?
Yeah, the 5 stages of grief.
Five
Yeah.
stages. She's the 5 stages of grief person. Yeah. So, and is that still a
Well,
thing?
I have real mixed feelings about that. So, incredible work that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross
Yeah.
did.
Because this is going back to the 60s, isn't it? It was in the 1960s, I think she
Yeah,
started her
quite a
work.
while ago, back in
Yeah.
the 60s and 70s. She has
Yeah.
revised it since then. Now, she was interviewing people who were dying when she came up with the 5 stages of grief. So the work that she did was never intended as a grief theory model, ever. But it's been hijacked because of that word stages. And almost
Yeah.
all people I see in my clinic arrive with I thought I had been through the 5 or the 7 stages of grief, but I'm doing it wrong. What am I doing
Yeah.
wrong?
Yeah.
And there is no such thing as a linear progression through any kind of grief event, any kind of loss.
Is there agreement? Is there agreement though of that there are 5 or 7 stages though? And what are they? Or because like what's what people talk denial?
Yeah, there's denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and meaning are the sort of key ones. And I suppose you might experience all of those, or you might experience just one, or you might go through a day where you're experiencing all of them, one after the other. You might have good phases or really more intense phases, but really the breadth of emotion that anyone can go through is so much more expansive than that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and what is acceptance? That's a really big question. I could talk about that for about an hour. I think my worry with that is that people feel like they can predict what they're going to feel in navigating grief, and you can't. You
Yeah.
can't predict it. So you might have a day where you feel kind of calm and okay and maybe quite optimistic, and then in the afternoon something happens and you feel really angry or really quite afraid or disappointed or despairing or hopeless, or it's much bigger than just those 5 stages.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, just on that line. I remember it's just, speaking to people who are bereaved by suicide. That like one recurrent thing comes to me is the only thing that's predictable about grief following suicide is its unpredictability.
Exactly.
Exactly, and it's the same, obviously, I assume across all sort of
Exactly.
grieving processes.
But we do know that everybody will feel pain, will feel the impact on it. And I think it impacts us mentally, so neurochemically, physically. That's something people don't know, that there's a physical side to grief, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. So
Yeah,
it isn't just an emotional experience, I don't think. It's a sort of total whole person experience. And I'm quite keen to create more discussion around that, more awareness around tools and how can you address that? What does it actually look? Because of course, as you know, every grief story is as unique as every life
yeah,
story.
yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's a sense that people need to do grief well, and that acceptance is about letting go. But what I really like about the work that Mary Frances O'Connor has done so well and is brilliant at writing about it is acceptance is maybe the opposite of that, of letting go of your loved one, of what once was, time and space, but keeping them close in your heart, incorporating them, kind of tuning into your connection with them without expecting them to be alive, which is a really painful thing. I mean,
Yeah,
deeply painful, isn't it? It's horrible.
yeah, but I suppose it comes to your point you're making earlier about you were saying you could spend an hour on acceptance. And say, so what is acceptance?
Mm.
If a lay person said to you, what is acceptance? And I know that
Yeah.
I'm really unfair, given you just said it'll take an hour. What's it? What is it? What would you tell?
Well, I can share with you my own experience. So one of the losses that I navigate endlessly is the loss of my health. I've been diagnosed with quite a serious autoimmune condition. Lucky to catch it early. Chances are it's probably going to get me at some point, but so facing the loss of health was a really profound thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And for me, acceptance, which again is sort of fluid, it's sort of some days are better than others, is releasing your attachment to a particular outcome, to a particular expectation when it comes to coping with death, coping with bereavement. I think it's accepting that your loved one is no longer in the physical material world. So
Mm-hmm.
getting used to that, making room for that, to live with that, rather than to keep getting lost in an imaginary kind of magical thinking scenario where you think, well, what if, and if only, because we know that delays adapting and assimilating loss. So that, I think, in a nutshell, is what acceptance is facing the pain of that, because that is deeply, deeply painful, isn't it? Because we're attached, we're bonded, we love, therefore we suffer.
Mhm.
Is there a way to kind of prepare yourself for grief, like to be ready for it?
That's such a good question. A lot of people are in anticipatory grief because they're dealing with losses of all kinds, whether it's a divorce or a loved one's got dementia or old age or whatever. I think to prepare is to face it, to check in, to notice what it's actually like for you to be you, and to be able to reflect on it, to observe it, to talk about it with other people who get it, who have some compassion for it, and maybe some lived experience of it, rather than to kind of go into superhuman mode or people-pleasing mode, or I'll deal with that when it's actually happened. And of course, having the privilege of navigating a good ending, so making the most of the time you have, living life fully, deeply, holding on to hope. I love what the wonderful Dame Deborah James was talking about before she passed. Hold on to hope, don't give up, and say what needs to be said. Very simple things, aren't they? But they really last a lifetime when you're coping with loss.
Related to that, Craig's question. So there are lots of myths and I assume, misunderstandings around grief. And
Yeah.
you've tackled one, which is people still think of the stages of grief, and made it very clear that people go through the stages in different ways. Not everybody goes through all of the stages. It's a unique experience. What are the other sort of common myths and misconceptions around grief?
One is that you need to protect your children from grief. That's
Yeah,
one that I see a lot, which you can't do. The other is that if you talk about it, you're making it worse. Sometimes, particularly amongst men, there seems to be some reluctance to reveal emotional or vulnerable aspects of life. What else? I can't think of them all now.
Well, there's two. Let's hone in on those two though. Just that one to do with children though, because that's one we've come across a lot in the suicide field as well.
Yeah.
So again, what advice would you give somebody, or is there key messages if you're trying to disclose or share grief with a child, or share loss with a child? Sorry.
Yeah, be honest, tell children the truth as much as you can, obviously in an age-appropriate way. Be available to talk to them at any time, even if that doesn't feel like an appropriate time. Because if you say, oh, I don't want to talk about that, or I can't deal with that now, what you're implicitly communicating to your child is that their emotions don't matter.
Yeah.
We don't want that. We want the opposite of that. So even if it's, in the supermarket aisle, make a moment and don't try and fix it. Try and sit with it. Try and show them physical compassion, emotional compassion, and allow that grief, that fear, that sadness, it's mainly sad, travel through them, and recognize that children will dip in and out of grief, traumatic grief, or perhaps grief that sits more within the natural order of things. They will be in it very intensely 1 minute, and 20 minutes later, they're, happily playing with their siblings like nothing's happened. And that's very, very normal. So kind of sit with that and have conversations. So get ahead of it, deal with your own grief. So don't leak out, don't be uncontrollable. Learn to moderate your grief in an age-appropriate way. Get comfortable with sadness. There are so many things I could say about that. And create that bubble of safety. So sometimes you might need respite as a family. So, connect, create little moments of joy, play, moments of awe, get out into nature. Children are amazing, aren't they? And that they live so in the present and so fully and so beautifully that I think sometimes they can be a wonderful antidote to what it is to be in the adult world.
Yeah.
They lean into that,
As long as it's done in a safe way and an age appropriate way, of course, honesty is the best policy as far as possible. That's really, really helpful. Okay, so I'm going to sort of pivot slightly though, Chloe, now, and we'll come back to some of the specific bits and bobs to do with grief in a second. But I'm just curious now to sort of focus a bit on your book. So can you tell us about how it came about? I know it's at the end of March. And what you're hoping, what's the key messages in the book?
Thank you. I'm so pleased that I got the chance to get this book out. It's It happened because HarperCollins came to me, which is very flattering and very unusual in some ways. And they recognized that there was a gap in their publications and in the market on a practical book to help people cope with loss, all kinds of loss. So the way I wrote it was, I always wanted to write a book, but I'd never really got around to it. So this was a brilliant opportunity. And I like to say yes if opportunities present themselves. And I've looked at loss holistically. So part of the book is explaining grief and the science of grief. So really simple chapters on the different types of grief, because it's not the same to lose a child as it is to go through a divorce, is it? So we use that word grief to encapsulate all sorts of things. So I've sort of tried to create a little bit of a roadmap of there are different ways of understanding your grief, answering questions like, when does grief become a mental illness, and is it a mental illness, and when do I seek help, when do I actually take action, things like that. And then I've looked at it as in, what's the impact of loss, micro losses like divorce, early retirement, moving home, loss of health, those that are not bereavement led, not that they're less important, but they're different.
You mentioned there was that they're called micro losses.
Yeah, micro losses. So they're not, it's annoying that word, because micro means small. I don't mean it like that. I just mean like they're sort of more in our daily lives. They're more present, and everybody goes through them at some point, a multitude of them. And then there's macro losses, which are really big losses, bereavement led, often traumatic, often very sudden and unexpected. So I've wanted to give the reader the very, very, literally a roadmap with practical tools to understand where are they with the impact they're experiencing, let's say with their mind, how are they mentally dealing with it, and then the physical side to it, and lots of stuff around how it might impact your nutrition, your sleep, your sex drive, your intimate relationships, all of that. Of course, socially, because that's a huge thing. I don't think we are very good at talking about, I mean, we're getting better, but I feel like there isn't as much community support for people.
Yeah. And so how long did it take you to write the book then? So
Well, it didn't take me very long, actually. So 10 months all in all.
Great.
And it's full of anonymized case studies, and it's full of what we've referred to as prescriptions, but they really are therapeutic tools and strategies that you would find, that you would be perhaps discussing with a therapist. I know therapy is really expensive, and I'm hoping that this democratizes it a little bit. So some people may not be able to afford therapy. Waiting lists are really long, but they might be able to afford this book and work through it.
Great. So just curious in the titling. So given you said at the start that you don't espouse, or you're less likely to espouse biomedical approaches, then so how did the prescription fit into the title?
Yeah,
it's a great title. It's really.
do you like it? Oh, thank you.
But I'm just curious.
Well, as I was going to say that earlier, in that when I first started in this world, I was very philosophical, existential. I'm not going to medicalize suffering. I don't want to blah 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 do that. But actually, the more I've worked in this field, and the longer I've kind of been reading research on it, I realize there is without doubt a manifestation of lived experience which has a neurochemical basis, and there's no point pretending that that's not there, because it is. So to ignore the kind of impact of dysregulated dopamine, serotonin, and cortisol, I think would be unprofessional at this stage. So I have married them up to be transparent. So I don't think you can medicalize grief in that there isn't an antidepressant you can take that will take your sadness away, but to understand the neurochemistry of loss and how it's manifesting in your own body is quite important. And to me, the word prescription seemed to work because I don't know, I quite liked it, and my editor quite liked it, and we came up with it as a kind of a way in which you can pick and choose what you think resonates with you, because not everything will apply to every reader. It's very tailored. You work at your own pace, and you pick what you like from all the different sections, and that felt a little bit prescriptive, but you choose the prescriptions.
So it's a tailored prescription approach.
Yeah, that's the idea.
And so it covers, you saying earlier, it covers all forms of grief, of course. So it gets and loss. But is it organized in terms of type of loss, or how is the book structured?
Yeah. So the way that I've done it is section 1 is all about understanding the science of grief for those who want to sort of delve into that a little bit more. So as I was saying, understanding the neurochemistry, the neurophysiology of grief, and the different types of grief and the potential mental health issues that might develop if you suppress it, if you don't find a way to allow it to travel through you. So there's lots of practical kind of advice, slightly psychoeducational. Because again, people don't really know. They don't know whether to go to a psychiatrist, to the GP, there's a lot of confusion out there, I think. And then the second section of the book is the holistic approach. So no matter what your loss, here are some tools, some very reflective, I guess, exercises that will help you engage with, the impact that your loss has had on your social welfare, your social well-being, on your identity, on your way in which you make meaning, on your spirituality. So it's not divided into particular types of loss. It's just inviting the reader to recognize where they are, and then how do they apply those tools to their particular experience.
Yeah.
Some people might find it quite a hard read. I know that's a bit of a weird thing to say, but it puts questions out there that might feel quite difficult, but hopefully helpful.
Yeah. And I assume it's the type of book you can dip in and out of in terms of
Yeah.
so in terms of I suppose one of the contentious topics in the broad and sort of the grief literature, I assume, is when does grief become that? Because of course, grief is a normal reaction to awful circumstances. I suppose so when does it become? You mentioned like a clinical diagnosis, or because obviously is it complicated? What's the status now in terms of where complicated grief fits? Still a term we still use, and is it still in DSM?
Yeah, so what we have in the DSM now, it's been revised, is prolonged grief disorder.
Right, so I knew it changed, isn't it? Or done something
Yeah,
change.
so that is when you have debilitating, I mean, there's lots of different criteria, but I suppose the headlines are you have such debilitating reaction to your grief event that you are not able to function within the norms of your community, of your cultural norms. And you are longing to be reconnected, because a lot of people will want to follow their loved one into the greater beyond, and you can't cope, are not functioning, are not able to embrace life again. So you're not moving through it. I think that 6 months is a bit strict. I'm a little bit reluctant to jump to that conclusion quickly, because if you've lost a child, I think it might take you longer than 6 months to feel like you finding acceptance. So clinicians, I think, need to use their perhaps nuanced understanding of a person's life and how that loss sits in their personal context. And then you have major depression that can follow an event of loss. And the clinical diagnostics for that there's two. So if a client or a patient is struggling to get out of bed for more than 14 days in a row, and it's a flat line, a dark cloud, then you're starting to potentially get into depression territory, and preventative action should be taken. If after a bereavement, it's been 2 months, and you're experiencing severe depression, then you're into major depression territory. But again, 2 months doesn't seem very long to me.
Yeah, because I mean, you're devastating loss. It's like when's the right period? Well, I suppose it relates in a bit to, I suppose, my sort of come towards the end of the sort of questions, but is thinking of cultural differences of sort of expectations around grief. I'm just thinking, in Judaism, obviously you've got a defined period of grieving, and then other religions, they've obviously other rules as well. So is that aspect covered in your book, and or what are your observations on those?
I don't go into the religious rituals, but I invite the reader to do that for their own practice. I think it's massively important. There are some religions that are very good at communally sharing loss and having rituals that support that, and others less so. So in the West, I think we've sanitized death. We don't really witness it. We don't often allow it to happen in our homes. We're very afraid of it, and there's less support. There's less support. But certainly I've seen many, many clients who find huge comfort in religious prayer, in believing in a cosmic design, a God that's there to love them and support them. So I think it's important. Very, very important.
I mean, I'm just even thinking of the differences in the UK. even,
Yeah.
and this is less, I suppose, is more a country thing. So being brought up in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, you had death was in the home because the way
Yes.
protests happened. I think that's really important, and I remember being surprised and continue to be surprised here. Is it in Scotland, and I know it's similar in England. And mostly, and I'm generalizing here. You're right. It's not the body. The remains aren't brought back to the home necessarily. They go straight from the funeral parlor to
Mm.
wherever the church, whatever it might be, and if there's cremation, whatever's happening. So you're right. I think that is that sanitization. Whereas
Yeah.
that whole ritual certainly have been in
Yes.
in Irish Catholicism certainly
Yeah.
of that waking the body, and that's so well for me. I think that's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to hear you say that. My grandfather was Irish and he passed away in Ireland. And my mother talked about how helpful it was to sit with his body in his
Mhm.
house and to literally stare at it and to look at it. And neuroimaging science, and of course, the wonderful kind of community of, what
Yeah.
Irish people are like coming around and incredible. We don't have that here. I've not really heard about that very much here in the UK. But we know from neuroimaging studies now that actually exposing the brain's chemistry, the neural network to the reality of this death actually helps to bear witness to death. It
Mhm.
helps to sit with a body. It helps to have a grave to go and sit by. It just helps. It creates the neural connections that integrate that absence.
No, fascinating, really fascinating. Okay, so just one last substantive question from me, and then we just try and end with a couple of unrelated questions. Is there anything else in terms of key message for somebody who has been recently bereaved, in
Mm.
terms of helping them, supporting them through their grief? Any key messages or take homes?
Yeah. I think my book focuses quite a lot on how grief feels like fear and throws us into that state of meaninglessness and hopelessness and fear that life's never going to be okay, that we're never going to be happy again. And my key message is that it's a really significant chapter in your life, but it doesn't have to be the whole of your life. And that actually you can surrender, let's say, to that sense that you will heal. You can use love, which is the antidote to fear, to find a way to be compassionate to yourself, to embrace that state of self-care, connection, and to kind of find personal meaning and purpose. So I think there is hope. It's a book that gives hope. Somebody I was talking to said, I really feel lost in loss. And that really kind of stayed with me. And I thought, well, maybe that's what my book can be, a little bit of light, a little bit of here's how you might navigate it. Take what works for you.
Yeah, I think your strap line is, and from the book, is for anyone seeking light in the
Yeah.
after loss. I think it's a really uplifting and hopefully continue.
Hopefully helpful. Hopefully. Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, it's launching on the 14th of March, so it'll be out
Oh,
then.
sorry, I
It's
think it's at the end of March there. Sorry, it's the
Yeah,
14th.
no, mid-March, but it will be an audible. I've just done the Audible for it, so I'm really excited about that, and it'll be an ebook. So hopefully it'll reach those who need it,
Yeah,
you know.
great, fantastic. Okay, just before we finish, then two quick fire questions for you, Chloe. First one is, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
That's such a good question. Be kind to yourself. Stop being so judgmental. I was quite judgmental of myself, sort of kind of perfectionism issues, and hold on to good people.
Great advice. Hold on to, yeah, good people, and yeah, be
Yeah.
kind. Excellent. Okay, and our last question then is, if you could choose one person that you would love to meet and have an in-depth
Yeah.
conversation with, so it could be famous, not famous.
Yeah,
Who would
there are
that be?
lots of people. There is a lady I'd really, really love to meet. I don't know if you've heard of her, Dr. Edith Egger, who has written, she is a American analyst who survived Auschwitz and lost her family and her parents. And her story is when she was in the death camp line, ready to be sent off to the gas chambers, she burst into a ballet dance.
Ah,
She was a 16-year-old who was almost a professional ballerina to grasp life. And Dr. Death saw her and pulled it out of the line, and she survived. But
hmm.
she has written so beautifully about her guilt, because her parents didn't survive, and how she navigated that she then went on to become an analyst and a therapist, and has written a beautiful book called The Choice, was all about that choice. I'd love to meet her. She's in her late 90s now, and I think she would
Yeah,
be a wonderful woman to talk to.
that's a brilliant suggestion.
Haven't
Yeah.
had the chance, but I may do. You never know.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
never know. Okay, well, on that optimistic note of longevity, it was great to have you on, Chloe. The very best of
Thank
luck
you.
with the book when it comes out next month, and thanks for sharing those tips about grief, and hopefully supporting those who are going through, as we all will encounter grief of all sorts, not
Yeah.
just traditional bereavement by law about people leaving this world through death, but other forms of loss. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really, really lovely to chat.